So we're continuing chapter 3, and so people want to figure out how it all relates to one another, and they eventually settle on it's more reliable to look at similarities in structures than just similarities in functions. But you do run into another problem, which is we've labeled stuff all over the world in each one of our own individual languages. You know, this person in his house just happened to label them all with people's names. But there's an issue where once science in the West was really starting to get rolling, you did have a lot of countries with a lot of different languages. And you wanted to be able to share your science with a broad range of people. So it was pretty quickly determined that everybody was going through the university system, so would go on to be what we would call scientists pretty much, were trained in ancient languages that were considered important, Latin and Greek. And for the most part, they settled on Latin as the language that everybody would learn and would write in when they wrote their science stuff up. So in Germany, you'd write in Latin. In Italy, you'd write in Latin, a little bit easier. In France, you'd write in Latin. In England, you'd write in Latin, because that way it gave everybody a common language to share information, including classification information. Now, as often happens, like we did with Francesco Redi, we often will find a person to kind of connect to for a lot of stuff that happened in science. And this guy is a pretty good person to connect to. Carl von Linné was a structuralist, is that he looked at homologies of things, specialized in plants, but also was very interested in kind of pulling together all the different systems of relatedness that people were working with. And he wasn't the only one doing it, but we kind of connect him to the system, and particularly to one particular item that he did kind of perfect, which was, so what's the smallest group? What's the most specific group that includes a population of all the same type? And we call that a species. And Carolus Linnaeus, Carl didn't write his name in his native language. He wrote Carolus Linnaeus because he was a little OCD and wrote everything in Latin. He came up with a way of naming species. Like you have here. Butterfly on the plant, foaming at the mouth. And it says, Johnson, back off. It's an Armandia litterdali, all right, but it's rabid. Now, this, Armandia litterdali, is a species name. And it's written correctly, according to Linnaeus's rules. Is it does these things don't always get written correctly. Here's another one where it goes, hey, what's this Drosophila melanogaster doing in my soup? It's a fruit fly. They've broken one of the rules here. Different editors don't necessarily know the science rules, so they break them. You see these rules broken all the time. But let's see what the rules are. So we've got Linnaeus and species names done according to binomial nomenclature. Things are done by people. Science is influenced by how the world works around them. Is Linnaeus looked at people and went, okay, we generally use two names to determine who someone is. We have their family name, which connects you to their group, and then their specific name that tells you who specifically they are within the family. Now the rules out in the general population are not really strict. If you're a screen actor, they are strict, is that you can't have the same first and last name as another registered member of the Screen Actors Guild, because they don't want that confusion. And Linnaeus wanted to come up with a similar system where only one name A species would have a name, no other species would use that name. And he came up with a system of two-name naming. That's what binomial nomenclature is a fancy term for. And species names wind up being two words. Now, I don't know where this came from. This isn't Linnaeus. This is English. If you're writing and you're writing a quote and somebody's speaking French or speaking a different language, it should be in italics. So when you're writing a foreign language, it's a kind of way of saying, yeah, I know, if you're trying to figure out what these English words are, they're not English. They're in italics. If you're handwriting, you're supposed to underline something like that. Well, at some point, they decided that that was going to apply to species names. So the first cartoon I had up here, the species name was in italics. The second one, it wasn't. Italics is the right approach. Now, the weird thing is that there's a whole bunch of other levels other than species that are also Latin words, and sometimes they're italicized and sometimes they're not. Species names are always supposed to be italicized. The other ones, the rule doesn't seem to always apply to. So, welcome to the wonderful world of labeling things. If you want to abbreviate a species name, you always write it out completely the first time, almost always. And then you abbreviate after that. That's also an English rule, where if you've got this long organization that people generally refer to as initials, you're supposed to write it out when you first introduce it and say, put the initials in parentheses. So that later on, when somebody comes across the initials and goes, what the heck is this again? They know somewhere up above, it's actually spelled out for them. And just like there in English, there's certain exceptions. You don't necessarily, if you write USA, you don't necessarily have to explain that it's United States of America. There are some species names that people just kind of know as their abbreviation. If you get bad hamburger and come down with E. coli, that's E period coli, in italics, supposed to be in italics. And everybody just kind of, and almost nobody you ask knows that E stands for Escherichia. It's a species of bacterium that lives in guts, lives in our guts. Different strains live in different animals like cow guts. They don't get along. You get sick. But that's an abbreviated species name. Weirdly enough, Drosophila melanogaster, which was in the second one, that's the common research fruit fly that they've done genetics on. People just call that Drosophila, even though there's like 30-some different species of Drosophila. Whenever somebody says, oh yeah, Drosophila in the lab, they know you're talking about melanogaster. So again, it's rules, but biologists are not that insane about following the rules. But we're gonna do it, doggone it. The first word is the genus. So Linnaeus took family names and swapped them around. Where your family name is second and tells you what group you're in, he put the group first, and it's the level above species. We'll get to the levels in a couple of minutes. And that word is always capitalized. The second word, from a classification standpoint, by itself doesn't mean anything. The same way that a lot of people have the same first name in the Screen Actors Guild, but only one person would have that first name with a particular family name, particular second name. Coli, E. coli, of the colon. There's a lot of species that are something coli. You can use that second word over and over and over again, and they do it because a lot of times the second word, it refers to something. It may refer to a color, it may refer to an appearance, it may refer to a person or a place. And here's where the second rule comes in. the cartoon I had up, Armandia litterdalii. Litterdal was a famous taxonomist, as he recorded and described many species of insects. And so people in honor will name a lot of stuff litterdalii. You don't get to capitalize it, even though it was his name. In the lab, we've got these little bitty lizards that people buy anoles. They're Anole corolliensis or Anole jamaican, depending on whether they're Jamaican or Carolina. But again, named after a place, you don't get to capitalize the word. The word is never, ever supposed to be capitalized. And this is a mistake that a lot of places make when they write out species names. They just put capital letter, but you're not supposed to. That's not the way it's supposed to work. So, what the heck is a species? Used to be, I know it when I see it. People are describing stuff and they go, well, this one's different enough from that one that we're going to put them in different species. You know, fox over here, dog over here. They're different enough. And then you'd bring different groups together and you'd find that they, if you locked them up for a while, they get bored and they would, mess around with each other, but you wouldn't get any babies from it. People went, oh, something else is going on here. Species can't reproduce with each other. So that was a rule for a while. Turns out there's a whole bunch of exceptions to that rule. And so it's really tough to define, and it's defined a bunch of different ways. I'm going to give you a fairly common modern definition that we're going to use that only applies to sexually reproducing organisms. But this is the best that we're going to do for this particular class, defining what a species is. So it's a group, it's a population. This kind of is a way of throwing up your hands and saying, well, they know which group they belong to. Why don't we let them do it? So it's a group that in nature sticks to its group. They know who belongs to the group. They don't reproduce outside of the group. In places where lions and tigers exist together, lions and tigers can reproduce in captivity if they start messing around. They produce sterile offspring. Now, it used to be a rule too, that part of the rule. But in nature, they don't do that. And again, there isn't a rule you can come up with for defining a species that you can't find exceptions to. So, dogs and wolves are supposed to be separate species, but, they don't necessarily read those books, and sometimes you'll get, dog wolves or wolf dogs or, combinations. But they still are considered separate species. Anyway, this is the definition we're going to use. And we're going to talk about groupings. Okay, I'm going to put an overhead up, so I'm going to move this to the side. I will come back to this. So large groups contain smaller groups. Big groups down at the bottom. Living things divided into 3 domains. That's becoming kind of iffy. It's been added in a very confusing way, like 20 or 30 years ago, but I'm going to ignore the domains. We're just going to work our way from the kingdoms on down. So kingdoms contain phyla, contain classes, contain orders, contain families, contain genera, which is the plural of genus, which contains species. So a species would be inside the bigger group of genus. Genus would be inside the bigger group of family. Family would be inside order. Order would be inside class, with a bunch of other orders. Class would be with other classes inside a phylum. So it's a progression. Now, the way I learned it, way back when I was in high school, was King Philip came over from Germany slowly, or King Philip came over for ginger snaps, but even then, nobody really ate ginger snaps. And there's a link in the book to about 80 different ways to memorize this order. I've been doing it too long, so I know kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, because that's locked in my head now. But I will expect you to be able to come up with the order and the tricky part of the order. This is science. People disagree about this stuff all the time. What do we do with this group? What do we do with that group? These two groups should be combined together. These two groups should be split apart more. You can't easily shift something from one group to another without messing with the ladder. You know? So there's a fudge factor grouping that they give us for disagreements. You can take a large group and go, okay, we got two collections here that are pretty closely related, but the two groups themselves are not as related as they are inside the groups. Within the order, I think there should be two suborders. And these families should be in this suborder, and these families should be in that suborder. You're allowed to do that. In some cases, you may go, this group and this group over here, I think they're more closely related than we give them credit for, but I don't think they're so closely related they should be smushed together into the same group. So what are we going to do? Well, I think we should develop a supergroup with these two groups inside of it. Super, above, you know, and sub below, and that way we can fiddle with classifications and show new linkages or show new splits in a way that doesn't completely disrupt the whole order of all the groups. So what happens when people disagree? I think that this group shouldn't be an order, it should just be a suborder within this other order. That's really nice. What group are you talking about? Oh, this group. You can see the issue. It's the fact that if I'm reading the book and I go, oh wow, I'm not used to this being called a suborder, I thought this was an order. That's a little confusing, but you imagine somebody at some point decided to shift it. But the thing is, the only way for you to know what group they're talking about is if they weren't allowed to change the name. So the names remain the same, and you can write a paper and go, and this should be a suborder, this should be a superphylum, this should be, you know, whatever. But the names given to the group, the accepted names, are not completely written in stone, but they're really hard to change. There's a whole process where you got to get a consensus, and you got to appeal to a group that used to meet in Geneva and I think meets in London now. And it is possible to change names, but it's not easy to do. And you need a really compelling reason to convince the group. Or it needs to be a group nobody cares about. And then they'll, yeah, okay, if a bunch of you guys think it'll change, then we'll change it. But that's how disagreements work within the system. For the last video, the last section, we're going to talk about the basic introductory biology kingdom system. And there's 6 kingdoms in it. Because there are disagreements, it turns out if you work in biology and open a book, there could be any number of kingdoms in the book. Some people split, you know, all of the living things up into 21 kingdoms. Some of them split it up into 9 kingdoms. Some of them split it into 9 kingdoms, but they're a different set of kingdoms. The group names stay the group names. So that if you're familiar with the group names, is that it's just confusing about how they put them into levels. But there is a basic introductory six-kingdom system that you get in most biology classes, and that's what we're gonna do in the next video.